Have you ever wondered why the idea of pirates still fascinates us so deeply? They steal across our imagination like ghosts on the horizon. Ships with black sails, gold glittering in hidden caves, and laughter echoing across a dark sea. But behind the legends, the parrots, and the rum, lies a story that is far older, stranger, and more human than we often realize. Piracy did not begin with the Caribbean. It began almost as soon as humans learned to sail. Where there are ships, there will always be those who take from them. Long before gunpowder, long before flags of skull and bone, the first pirates were already prowling the ancient seas. In the time of the Greeks and Phoenicians, more than 3,000 years ago, the Mediterranean was the center of the known world. Merchants carried wine, olive oil, grain, and precious metals between kingdoms. And in that same water, others waited. They came from hidden coves and rocky islands, rowing fast ships with sharp prows, striking before their victims even had time to pray. In the writings of Homer, in the Odyssey itself, the word pirate already existed. Pirates, meaning one who attacks. To ancient people, pirates were both feared and, strangely, admired. They were free in ways most could not be. No kings, no taxes, no oaths, only the open sea. They lived by their own laws, or sometimes by none at all. To farmers chained to soil, to sailors bound to masters, that kind of freedom was both terrifying and intoxicating. Even the greatest empires could not escape them. The Greeks fought pirates constantly. The Romans, too, suffered greatly at their hands. In the 1st century before the birth of Christ, pirates grew so powerful that they raided the city of Ostia, the very harbor of Rome, capturing senators and demanding ransom from the mighty republic. The sea had become lawless. Trade collapsed, and so Rome sent one man to end it, Pompeius Magnus, whom history remembers as Pompey the Great. Pompey was given extraordinary powers, control over the entire Mediterranean and all its coasts. Within 3 months, he crushed the pirates' fleets, captured their leaders, and destroyed their havens. Rome celebrated, trade resumed, and piracy seemed to vanish. But it never truly did. It only changed shape, waiting for new oceans to explore. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The Vikings swept through the northern seas, their long ships slicing through fog and legend alike. They were raiders, traders, settlers, and yes, pirates. They attacked monasteries, villages, and ships from Britain to Byzantium, taking silver, slaves, and fame. Their sagas speak of both terror and glory. To some, they were demons. To others, heroes. It depends, as always, on which side of the sword you stood. By the time the Middle Ages arrived, piracy had become part of the global rhythm of trade and war. In the Indian Ocean, Arab corsairs hunted merchant ships carrying spices and silk. In the seeker South China Sea, pirate fleets controlled entire ports. In the English Channel, French and English privateers battled endlessly, each claiming that they were patriots and that the other side were pirates. It was an old trick. When you fight for your king, you are a privateer. When you fight for yourself, you are a pirate. The difference, in truth, was often written only on paper. And then came the Age of Discovery, a time that changed everything. When Europeans began to cross the Atlantic, they brought not only their flags and faiths, but also their greed and rivalry. Spain, Portugal, England, France, and the Netherlands all fought for control of the new worlds they were discovering. Gold and silver flowed back to Europe in vast quantities, and wherever there was treasure, there were men willing to steal it. The so-called Golden Age of piracy would not truly begin until the 17th century. But its seeds were sown here, in the blood and ambition of empire. Spanish galleons sailed heavy with silver from the mines of the Americas, bound for Seville and Cadiz. They were rich, slow, and tempting. Privateers from England and France stalked them across the Caribbean, attacking under letters of marque, official documents that made theft legal, as long as the loot was taken from an enemy. Men like Francis Drake became national heroes for what, in another context, would be called robbery. Drake circumnavigated the globe, burned Spanish towns, and returned home with enough treasure to pay off England's debts. Queen Elizabeth I herself knighted him on the deck of his ship. It is one of history's great ironies that a pirate became a gentleman by royal decree. But when peace returned, when treaties were signed and wars ended, thousands of sailors found themselves unemployed. They had learned to fight, to steal, to navigate storms and gunfire. Now, there were no kings to pay them, no legal targets to chase. And so, naturally, many kept doing what they knew best, only now, without permission. That was how the Golden Age began. A storm of desperate men set adrift by peace. They sailed from hidden coves in the Bahamas, the coast of Hispaniola, and the harbors of Jamaica. They built floating communities, bound not by nationality, but by necessity. Among them, there was a strange kind of democracy. Captains were elected by their crews. Loot was shared according to agreed rules. Even discipline was decided by vote. For all their violence, pirates were among the earliest practitioners of equality at sea. In a world ruled by kings, they lived by contract. Some ships even had written constitutions, known as the Articles of Agreement. These spelled out shares of plunder, codes of conduct, and punishments for betrayal. Breaking them was not just a crime. It was a sin against the brotherhood. And though many of these men were brutal, their ships became strange havens of freedom. Sailors of every color and language worked side by side. Freed slaves, escaped debtors, and outcasts found a kind of belonging among the lawless. The sea was harsh, but it did not care who your father was. By the early 18th century, the early 1700s, written properly, the Caribbean had become the stage for an extraordinary cast of characters. Blackbeard, whose real name was Edward Teach, ruled terror with his fearsome image, a tall man with slow-burning fuses in his beard, eyes smoldering in the smoke. Charles Vane, Stede Bonny, Anne Bonny, Mary Red, and Calico Jack Rackham. Their stories blend truth and myth until they are inseparable. Each had their own reasons for turning pirate: revenge, freedom, desperation, or thrill. Anne Bonny, for instance, defied every rule of her time. She disguised herself as a man, fought in battles, and lived fiercely, her name whispered in fear by the powerful. Mary Red, too, fought beside her. Two women who refused to be erased by history's bias. They were not side characters in men's tales. They were pirates in their own right, their courage unquestionable. Pirate ships of that era were dangerous, but also deeply organized. They had hierarchies, codes, and even medical funds for injured crew. Plunder was divided fairly. The captain and quartermaster received slightly larger shares, but far less than the kings or admirals of Europe would have taken. Mutiny was rare because power was shared. In a strange way, the pirate ship was a floating experiment in democracy, centuries ahead of its time. Of course, they were also killers, thieves, and smugglers. The romantic image of pirates, the songs, the rum, the buried treasure, hides a life that was mostly misery. Ships leaked, food rotted, disease spread, and death was constant. Most pirates never found treasure, they found the gallows. But the legend endured because, beneath the blood, there was something people recognized. The longing to be free, even if it meant dying for it. As the 18th century moved on, the great powers grew tired of the chaos. Trade was too valuable to risk, and pirate hunting became a professional business. Navies expanded, ports were fortified, and captured pirates were hanged publicly, a warning to others. By the middle of that century, the Golden Age was over. The seas grew quiet again, at least on the surface. But piracy never died. It moved. In the 19th century, it haunted the coasts of China and the South China Sea, where vast fleets of junks attacked merchants and colonial ships alike. In the 20th and 21st centuries, it appeared again off the coasts of Somalia, in the Straits of Malacca, in the Caribbean of commerce, digital piracy, stealing not gold, but information. The tools change. The motive remains. Piracy, at its core, is rebellion against control, a refusal to bow to kings, corporations, or nations. It is as much a symbol as it is a crime, and that is perhaps why the pirate endures in story. Because deep down, even the most lawful heart feels a spark of envy for those who live without rules, who answer to no one but the wind and the waves. If you imagine a pirate ship, you probably see chaos. Men shouting, cannons roaring, sails flapping wildly, and maybe someone playing a fiddle in the corner. But in truth, life aboard a pirate vessel was far more structured and far less glamorous than the movies would have you believe. A pirate ship was not a floating tavern, nor a place of endless adventure. It was a workplace, rough, filthy, and constantly in motion. It smelled of salt, sweat, gunpowder, and the faint, sweet odor of decay. There was no escape from it. Even the ocean breeze could not mask the stench of men who had not bathed in months. Food was a daily struggle. Pirates, like all sailors of the time, lived on what was called ship's biscuit, a hard, dry cracker that could break a tooth faster than any sword fight. It was baked until it was more stone than bread, to prevent it from spoiling. When food ran low, they soaked it in beer or water to soften it, though water often carried algae, and beer was safer simply because it was mildly alcoholic. A good pirate learned to chew carefully and to ignore the small black insects that often made the biscuit their home. If you bit into something crunchy, you just told yourself it was extra protein. Meat, when available, was salted pork or beef. Over time, it hardened and turned gray, but it was still better than starving. Fresh fruit and vegetables were rare, and so was vitamin C, which meant that scurvy, a disease caused by lack of it, ran rampant. Gums bled, teeth fell out, skin bruised at the lightest touch. Some pirates joked that they could not tell if they were turning into ghosts or simply dying slowly. And perhaps both were true. Drinking was constant, not for celebration, but for survival. Fresh water spoiled quickly in wooden barrels, developing a taste that could make a grown man weep. So pirates drank rum, beer, or watered wine instead. Rum, in particular, became their trademark. It was cheap, strong, and easily stolen from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. Mixed with water, lime juice, and sugar, it became grog, the sailor's standard drink. It kept morale up, and perhaps more importantly, kept people from thinking too much about the smell of the biscuits. Despite the harshness, life aboard had its rhythms. Every man had a role: helmsman, gunner, carpenter, surgeon, cook. Even in lawlessness, there was order. The captain gave commands during battle, but outside of it, decisions were often made democratically. If the crew disliked a captain, they could vote to replace him. It was the sea's version of early democracy: messy, loud, and occasionally solved with a knife. Discipline varied from ship to ship. Some captains ruled with terror, others with fairness. Punishments could be brutal: whipping, marooning, or the infamous keel hauling, where a man was dragged under the ship's barnacled hull. But pirates valued loyalty, and too much cruelty risked mutiny. In many ways, they lived by an unspoken truth: a good captain led by respect, not by fear. That, in itself, was rare in the world of the 1700s, or, to write it properly, the 18th century. The pirate's code, though informal, was sacred. The Articles of Agreement might include rules such as, all shall have an equal vote. No man shall strike another aboard the ship. Every man shall keep his arms clean and fit for service. And whoever shall be found guilty of cowardice or theft shall suffer death or marooning. It was, in its strange way, a moral order among thieves. A pirate might steal from the world, but never from his brothers. Even shares of plunder were carefully distributed, not out of kindness, but out of pragmatism. A fair crew is a loyal crew. Pay was simple. When a prize ship was captured, the goods were divided according to a prearranged scale. The captain might take 2 shares, the quartermaster 1.5, and everyone else 1 share each. Even those injured in service were compensated. A lost leg might earn you 800 pieces of 8, a lost eye 600. It was crude insurance, but it worked. After all, the world's first form of Social Security probably smelled faintly of salt and gunpowder. Superstition was a constant companion. The sea was unpredictable, and pirates were nothing if not respectful of its moods. Whistling was considered bad luck. It was said to summon a storm. Killing an albatross was unthinkable, a sin against nature itself. And women aboard ships were thought to bring misfortune. Though, ironically, some of the most successful pirates in history were women. As always, belief bends when survival demands it. There were other strange customs. Before battle, some pirates dressed in their finest stolen clothes: silk shirts, red coats, jewelry, and ribbons. They wanted to look impressive, even in death. After all, if you were going to be hanged someday, you might as well look stylish in the illustrations. Weapons varied. Cutlasses, short, curved swords, were preferred for close combat, while pistols were prized but unreliable, often taking longer to reload than the fight itself. Grenados, small, hand-thrown bombs, added smoke and confusion to the chaos. Cannon fire was the symphony of piracy, the deep-throated roar that echoed across the waves. And yet, most battles were over before a single cannon fired. Fear, more than firepower, won the day. A ship faced with the black flag, the skull and crossbones, or the hourglass of death, often surrendered rather than risk annihilation. Ah yes, the flag. Each pirate captain designed his own. Some were simple, a white skull on black. Others were elaborate, showing skeletons, bleeding hearts, or hourglasses reminding sailors that time was running out. These flags were meant to terrify, but also to identify. They were, in a sense, the first brand logos in history. instantly recognizable symbols of dread. Some modern companies could only dream of such marketing impact. Below deck, life was cramped beyond belief. Dozens of men shared a space smaller than a modern living room. They slept in hammocks, swung above barrels and boxes, and woke covered in sweat or salt. Privacy did not exist. Every sound, snoring, coughing, muttering, became part of the background symphony of existence. The only solitude was the night sky above, endless and indifferent. And yet, despite the filth and danger, pirates often described feeling freer than they ever had on land. The sea had no walls. It asked no questions about your birth, your debts, or your sins. It was both cruel and kind, a god without temples. Many pirates, when asked why they chose such a life, gave the same answer: better to live free for 1 year than a slave for a lifetime. That was the paradox of piracy. It was both a crime and a philosophy, a rejection of a world that offered nothing but chains. And perhaps that is why the stories still endure, because they remind us that even the darkest freedom can shine brighter than gilded captivity. But our journey is far from over. The story of piracy stretches far beyond the Caribbean, across the Mediterranean, into the Indian Ocean, and along the coasts of Africa and Asia. There were Chinese pirate queens who commanded armadas, African privateers who fought empires, and Barbary corsairs who reshaped trade itself. Each of them deserves their own tale. If you look at history closely, you begin to see that piracy was never limited to the Caribbean or to the romantic tales of wooden ships and treasure maps. Piracy is as old as seafaring itself. It has haunted every ocean, from the calm waters of the Mediterranean to the vast expanse of the Indian Ocean and the endless blue of the South China Sea. Wherever merchants tried to move goods, there were others waiting to take them. The sea, after all, has no borders, and that is both its beauty and its danger. Long before the famous pirates of the 18th century, piracy had already been an essential part of human trade. In the ancient world, the Mediterranean Sea was the center of civilization. Ships carried olive oil, wine, and grain between Greece, Egypt, and the Near East. And among those trade routes, hidden behind islands or rocky peninsulas, were men who saw an easier way to make a living. They were not farmers or merchants. They were thieves of the tide. The Greeks called them pirates, a word that means one who attacks. It is, in fact, where the word pirate comes from. Even in the epic tales of Homer, the heroes sometimes behaved like pirates, raiding villages and taking hostages, blurring the line between soldier, sailor, and criminal. As time went on, piracy grew in scale and organization. The Roman Empire, which prided itself on order and civilization, found its trade collapsing under the constant assault of sea raiders. Entire fleets of Roman grain ships vanished into the blue, taken by pirates who operated from hidden ports in Crete and Cilicia. At its worst, the problem became so severe that the pirates attacked Rome's own harbor at Ostia, capturing senators and demanding ransom. The city that ruled the world could not even protect its own shores. It was only when Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was given command over the entire Mediterranean that the tide finally turned. In 3 months, he swept through the sea, destroying pirate bases and capturing thousands of men. It was one of the earliest examples of a global campaign against organized crime. And yet, as with all such victories, the peace did not last forever. Piracy was not a problem that could be eradicated. It was an instinct, the shadow cast by trade itself. As centuries passed, the same story repeated in different oceans. When one empire rose, pirates followed its ships. When one empire fell, pirates filled the vacuum it left behind. In Northern Europe, during the early Middle Ages, the Vikings became the terror of the seas. They were not merely pirates, they were farmers, explorers, and poets. But their raids on monasteries and villages from Britain to Byzantium earned them that title nonetheless. They sailed in longships, fast and sleek, able to cross oceans or navigate shallow rivers. Their sudden attacks left entire towns burned to ash before word could spread. To the people they attacked, they were monsters. To their own people, they were heroes. And that duality, that mix of fear and admiration, would cling to the image of pirates for the rest of history. Further south, along the coasts of North Africa, another form of piracy took shape. These were the Barbary corsairs, operating from ports like Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli. They were both pirates and privateers, depending on who was paying them. Their ships hunted Christian merchants across the Mediterranean, seizing cargo and enslaving crews. Between the 16th and the 19th centuries, historians estimate that more than 1 million Europeans were captured and sold in the slave markets of North Africa. It was piracy mixed with politics, sanctioned by rulers who profited from it. Even nations like England and France sometimes paid tribute to keep their ships safe. It was a business arrangement built on fear. Meanwhile, on the far side of the world, piracy took on different forms. In the Indian Ocean, fleets of Arab and Malay sea raiders targeted the spice trade routes that connected Africa, India, and the East Indies. These were not ragtag bands of outlaws, but organized societies, often supported by local rulers who saw piracy as an extension of taxation. In some regions, piracy was practically an industry, one that employed entire coastal communities. Ships would be attacked not by lone marauders, but by coordinated squadrons, their movements planned like military campaigns. When Western traders later arrived, they were shocked to find that the seas they thought were open for commerce were already claimed by centuries of native piracy. And then, in the Far East, there were the pirates of China, the most numerous and, in some ways, the most successful in history. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, enormous pirate confederations ruled the South China Sea. At their peak, some fleets included hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of sailors. Among their leaders was a woman known as Qing Shi, or Madame Cheng, who began her life as a prostitute in Canton and ended it as one of the most powerful figures in maritime history. After her husband, a pirate captain, was killed, she took command of his fleet and transformed it into a disciplined empire of the sea. Her code was strict. No one was to harm captives without permission. No one was to steal from the common plunder, and disobedience was punished by death. Under her rule, Chinese authorities were forced to negotiate peace rather than risk annihilation. To this day, she remains one of the few pirates who retired comfortably, dying in her bed rather than on a noose. All these different oceans, cultures, and centuries share one truth. Piracy was not chaos, but a system. It existed where law was weak and wealth was moving. Pirates were opportunists, but they were also products of their time. In the Caribbean, they were the byproduct of empire and war. In the Mediterranean, they were the side effect of politics and religion. In Asia, they were the inevitable result of trade expanding faster than governments could control it. Wherever humanity built ships, someone found a way to rob them. To those living on land, piracy might have seemed senseless violence. But from the pirate's perspective, it was survival, and sometimes even justice. Many who turned to piracy did so because the legal world had no place for them. Sailors were often treated worse than slaves, beaten, underpaid, and discarded when injured. Merchant captains enforced brutal discipline. Naval service was worse. Impressment, the forced recruitment of men into the Navy, made thousands of unwilling sailors fight for kings they hated. For them, the black flag was not a symbol of crime. It was a banner of rebellion. It is worth remembering that the pirate's ship, for all its grime and hardship, was one of the few places in the early modern world where democracy truly existed. Captains were elected, not crowned. Decisions were voted on, not dictated. Even plunder was divided by rule, not by privilege. There was fairness among thieves that the noble courts of Europe could only dream of. Of course, this equality had its limits. A mutiny could turn that democracy into a knife fight in seconds. But the principle was there. In a world obsessed with hierarchy, pirates built floating republics. And perhaps that is what still fascinates us. For all the filth and blood, there was a strange purity in piracy, a rejection of hypocrisy. They did not pretend to be moral. They did not dress their violence in divine justification. They lived outside the law and accepted its consequences. The price of freedom was death, and they were willing to pay it. In an age when kings called their wars holy, pirates were at least honest about their greed. That honesty, paradoxically, makes them timeless. Even today, piracy has not disappeared. It has only changed its form. Modern pirates off the coast of Somalia do not wear eye patches or say "R." They use speedboats, radios, and satellite phones. They hijack oil tankers instead of galleons. Digital pirates, sitting quietly behind computers, steal not gold, but information. In every century, the tools change, but the motive remains the same. Rebellion against control, the desire to claim what others own, and beneath it all, the search for freedom in a world built on ownership. Piracy, then, is not merely a footnote in history. It is a mirror. It reflects the greed of empires, the desperation of poverty, the cruelty of inequality, and the unending human thirst for freedom. And that is why, even now, when you close your eyes and imagine the sea, you can almost hear it. The faint sound of a creaking ship, the whisper of wind through rigging, and a voice calling out from the dark. Raise the black flag. If you mention the word pirate to almost anyone today, one name rises above all the rest. Blackbeard. His real name was Edward Teach, though some sources spell it Thatch or Thatch. Even historians seem to argue about it, as if the man himself enjoyed confusing us from beyond the grave. He lived in the early 18th century, during the final years of the so-called Golden Age of piracy, and his reputation became so enormous that even the British Empire trembled at the mention of his name. Blackbeard's appearance was designed for terror. He was a tall man with a thick, wild beard that reached down to his chest. Before battle, he would twist pieces of slow-burning rope into his hair and light them, so that smoke curled around his face like a ghostly halo. Imagine seeing that in the dim light of dawn. A man with fire in his beard, eyes like coals, and the black flag fluttering behind him. It is no wonder that many ships surrendered without a fight. Some said he was a devil, others a madman. But those who knew him personally described him as surprisingly calm, even polite. His violence was theatrical, a calculated performance meant to frighten rather than destroy. He captained a ship called Queen Anne's Revenge, a former French slave vessel armed with 40 guns. In her brief career, she captured dozens of merchant ships along the American coast and in the Caribbean. But like many pirates, Blackbeard's reign was short. In the year 1718, he was cornered by Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy off the coast of North Carolina. After a fierce hand-to-hand battle, Blackbeard was killed. When they counted his wounds, they found 5 bullet holes and more than 20 cuts from swords and knives. Legend says that even after his head was severed, his body swam around the ship before sinking into the depths. It probably didn't. But it makes a good story. And that, after all, is what pirates are best at. Yet Blackbeard was only one figure among many. There was Henry Morgan, a man who began as a privateer, fighting legally under the English crown against Spain, and ended as the lieutenant governor of Jamaica. Morgan's raids on Spanish ports like Portobelo and Panama were so brutal that even his own government pretended to be shocked. When his men captured Panama City in 1671, they burned much of it to the ground. But in the politics of the time, such acts were rewarded. Morgan returned to England a hero and was later knighted, proof that one man's pirate is another man's patriot. He died wealthy, surrounded by the same Caribbean luxury he had once stolen. It is tempting to imagine him smiling at the irony. Another name, less known but equally fascinating, is Calico Jack Rackham. His nickname came from his flamboyant love of brightly patterned clothing. Calico, being a kind of printed cotton fabric. Jack was not a particularly successful pirate in terms of loot, but he achieved immortality for another reason. His crew included 2 of the most famous female pirates in history, Anne Bonny and Mary Red. Their story remains one of the most extraordinary in the annals of the sea. Anne Bonny was born in Ireland around the year 1698 and later moved to the island of New Providence in the Bahamas. There she met Calico Jack and joined his crew, disguising herself as a man when necessary, though it is said that most of the crew quickly learned her secret and respected her for her ferocity. Mary Red's story was even stranger. She had been raised as a boy by her mother to claim inheritance money that would otherwise have gone to a male child. She served as a soldier, then a sailor, before falling into piracy. When Anne and Mary met aboard Calico Jack's ship, they became inseparable. Witnesses said they fought more fiercely than any of the men. Their end came in November of the year 1720, when their ship was captured by the English Navy. Most of the crew were drunk at the time, and the fight was over quickly. Anne and Mary were sentenced to hang, but both claimed to be pregnant, a strategy that delayed their executions, as the law forbade killing an unborn child. Mary died of fever in prison. Anne, somehow, disappeared from the records. Some believe her father paid for her release. Others think she escaped and lived quietly under a false name. Either way, she vanished from history. perhaps the cleverest escape of all. Beyond the Caribbean, the world of piracy extended into the Indian Ocean, where men like Henry Every and William Kidd wrote their own bloody chapters. Henry Every, sometimes spelled Avery, was an English sailor who, in the year 1695, led a mutiny and captured a ship called the Fancy. He then went on to commit one of the most infamous acts of piracy in history: the capture of the Ganges Sawai, a massive treasure ship belonging to the Mughal Empire of India. That single raid yielded riches beyond imagination: gold, silver, and jewels worth millions in today's money. The attack caused a diplomatic crisis between England and India, nearly collapsing trade relations. Every vanished soon after, his fate unknown. Some said he retired rich, others claimed he died in poverty. His disappearance only added to his legend, turning him into a ghost that haunted the imagination of every sailor who dreamed of fortune. William Kidd's story, by contrast, shows how easily a privateer could become a criminal in the eyes of the powerful. Captain Kidd began with a royal commission to hunt pirates, not to be one. But when he captured an Armenian ship called the Quetta Merchant, a prize technically belonging to allies of England, the political winds turned against him. He was arrested, brought to London, and tried for piracy. The trial was swift and deeply unfair. He was hanged in 1701, and his body was left to rot in an iron cage over the River Thames as a warning to others. Rumors of his buried treasure spread for centuries afterward, fueling countless treasure hunts. People still dig for it today, though none have found anything but disappointment, and perhaps a new appreciation for how easily greed outlives reason. Across the globe, in the South China Sea, the story of Qing Shi stands apart from them all. She began her life as a prostitute in Canton in the late 18th century, married a pirate captain named Zheng Yi, and after his death assumed command of his enormous fleet, known as the Red Flag Fleet. Under her leadership, this armada grew to include more than 1,500 ships and perhaps 80,000 sailors. Governments and navies trembled before her. She negotiated her own amnesty with the Chinese authorities on her terms, keeping her wealth and retiring peacefully to run a gambling house. It is difficult not to admire her. While most pirates ended on the gallows, she ended at the card table, and probably one more there too. What unites these lives, from Blackbeard to Qing Shi, is not just their defiance of law, but their mastery of image. They understood that fear is as powerful a weapon as any cannon. A well-told rumor could win a battle before it began. Pirates were, in a sense, the first masters of psychological warfare. They cultivated legend as carefully as they loaded gunpowder. The black flag, the flaming beard, the flamboyant coat, all were part of the theater of terror. The sea was their stage, and their audience was the world's imagination. It is remarkable, too, how quickly society transformed these criminals into heroes once they were safely dead. The same governments that hanged them later celebrated them in novels and plays. By the 19th century, writers like Robert Louis Stevenson had turned pirates into symbols of adventure and freedom. Treasure Island made children dream of buried gold, parrots, and maps marked with an X. The brutality was softened, the fear replaced by romance. The pirate became the outlaw with a code, the rebel who lived free of authority. It was a comforting myth, and one that still sails today in films, theme parks, and Halloween costumes. In truth, the real pirates were far less glamorous. They suffered hunger, disease, injury, and despair. Most died young and violently. But perhaps their legend endures not because of what they did, but because of what they represented: the refusal to kneel. In a world of kings and empires, they lived by their own rules, even if those rules led them to ruin. There is something profoundly human in that contradiction: our craving for freedom, even at the cost of destruction. The history of piracy, then, is not a simple tale of good and evil. It is a mirror of civilization itself. Every pirate ship was a tiny world, cruel, democratic, reckless, and, in its strange way, honest. They remind us that freedom and chaos are siblings, and that the sea, in all its vastness, is both cradle and grave for those who seek to live without chains. When the age of piracy finally came to an end, the world did not grow quiet. It merely learned to speak about pirates in a different way. The ocean that had once echoed with cannon fire now carried songs and stories. The same men and women who had been called criminals were reborn in legend, stripped of their diseases, their hangovers, and their bad tempers, and clothed instead in myth. The transformation from outlaw to icon was not accidental. It was civilization's way of forgiving itself for loving rebels. Governments, meanwhile, learned a few lessons from their troublesome sea wolves. The relentless chaos of the 17th and 18th centuries forced nations to invent new systems of law to protect trade. Maritime insurance was born out of fear of piracy. The concept of international waters, zones where no nation could claim control, was clarified precisely because pirates had exposed how fragile the idea of sovereignty could be. In a strange twist, pirates helped define the very laws designed to destroy them. Their existence forced humanity to agree on what the word civilized should mean. The British Empire, which had once employed privateers to plunder Spanish ships, began to take a moral stance against piracy. A little late, but better late than never, as history so often does. Naval patrols were established in the Caribbean, the Indian Ocean, and later off the coasts of Africa. Piracy was declared an offense against all nations, a crime so universal that any country could prosecute it, regardless of where it occurred. This principle, known as hostis humani generis, the enemy of all mankind, still exists in international law today. It is, in many ways, the intellectual skeleton of modern global justice. And yes, it all began because someone could not keep their hands off someone else's ship. But while the courts were tightening their laws, the public imagination was doing the opposite. In the coffee houses of London and Amsterdam, people devoured newspapers filled with exaggerated tales of pirate exploits. The more terrifying the account, the better it sold. Publishers quickly realized that pirates were the perfect characters for storytelling. Dangerous enough to thrill, distant enough to romanticize. In the 18th century, a book titled A General History of the Pirates appeared, supposedly written by a man named Captain Charles Johnson. No one is sure who Johnson really was. Some think it was the novelist Daniel Defoe writing under a pseudonym. But his collection of pirate biographies became a sensation. That book is the reason we know many of these pirates at all. It is the first source to describe Blackbeard's flaming beard, to tell of Anne Bonny and Mary Red, and to turn men like Calico Jack and Henry Every into legends. Of course, much of it was exaggerated or invented. But in the public's mind, it didn't matter. Pirates had become characters, part history, part theater, and entirely irresistible. Over time, the legend softened. In the 19th century, novelists took the rough edges off piracy and turned it into adventure. Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island redefined the genre entirely. Gone were the diseases, the desperate hunger, the hangings. In their place came rum, buried gold, and maps marked with an X. The pirate became a charming villain, dangerous, yes, but also witty and brave. It was storytelling alchemy, turning blood into gold, horror into nostalgia. Even today, when we imagine pirates, we picture Stevenson's creation more than history's truth. By the 20th century, the pirate had climbed out of books and into film. Silent movies of the 1920s brought swashbuckling heroes to life, with swords clashing and shirts conveniently unbuttoned. Then came Errol Flynn in Captain Blood and the Sea Hawk, dancing across the deck with effortless charm. He was a pirate polished by Hollywood, too clean to smell of salt, too handsome to ever need a dentist. The audiences adored him. And then, of course, came the modern era. The theme parks, the blockbusters, the animatronic skeletons grinning forever in the dark. The most famous pirate of the 21st century is not a murderer or a mutineer, but a man named Jack Sparrow who drinks too much, lies constantly, and still manages to be lovable. It is absurd and yet strangely fitting. The myth has completed its transformation, from terror to comedy, from warning to entertainment. The pirate has become the clown prince of the sea. Yet behind all this laughter, the reality of piracy never fully vanished. Even today, there are parts of the world where the old dangers persist. Off the coast of Somalia, in the narrow waters of the Gulf of Aden, modern pirates still attack cargo ships, often with speedboats and assault rifles instead of cannons and cutlasses. Their motives are familiar: poverty, desperation, and greed. But their tools have changed. Some operate with surprising sophistication, using satellite phones, GPS trackers, and encrypted communications. They hijack oil tankers, take crews hostage, and negotiate million-dollar ransoms. It is the same game played with new pieces. The difference is that today, pirates rarely see themselves as romantic figures. They are, in truth, products of failed states and collapsing economies. When fishermen can no longer survive, they turn to raiding ships, just as their ancestors did centuries ago. It is the same equation repeated by time. When order fails, piracy returns. The sea does not care who governs it. It belongs to whoever dares to take it. And then there are the digital pirates, men and women who never leave dry land but sail instead through networks and cables. They steal not gold, but information. They hack into systems, copy music and films, leak secrets, and challenge the power of corporations. Some call them criminals, others call them activists, and perhaps both are correct. In a strange sense, they are the spiritual heirs of the old sea rovers, rebels against control, sailing invisible seas of data. They too raise their own kind of black flag, the anonymous mask, the open-source manifesto, the declaration that information should be free. It is piracy without sails, but not without philosophy. If you think about it, the persistence of piracy across so many centuries says something profound about human nature. We are creatures of curiosity and defiance. We admire order, but we secretly love rebellion. The pirate represents the part of us that resists control, The whisper in the back of the mind that says, "What if I took what they said I couldn't?" Civilization builds walls. Pirates climb them. Society writes laws. Pirates test them. The line between hero and villain, between freedom and chaos, has always been thinner than we like to admit. It is also worth noting how much of our modern culture, even beyond fiction, still carries traces of the pirate age. The global maritime system, the laws that govern ships, trade, and territorial waters, was shaped by the need to prevent piracy. The insurance industry, one of the financial pillars of modern capitalism, was born from merchants trying to protect themselves from sea raiders. The flags that ships fly today, indicating nationality, are descendants of the pirates' need to show or hide their allegiance. Even the idea of international law owes its birth to those days when the sea was the last frontier of lawlessness. And perhaps the greatest legacy of all is linguistic. Our languages are full of pirate echoes, words like buccaneer, privateer, maroon, booty, cutlass, and plunder. Even the romantic phrase sailing under false colors comes directly from their world, where deception was a strategy, not a shame. In a way, every time we use these words, we keep their ghosts alive. It is ironic, then, that the world which once hunted pirates now sells their image on t-shirts and toys. The same black flag that once promised death now decorates children's bedrooms. The parrot, the eye patch, the wooden leg, all have been sanitized and commodified. We have turned terror into nostalgia and crime into costume. But perhaps that too is part of our nature. Humanity has always turned its nightmares into stories, because stories are how we tame the dark. Still, somewhere beneath the myths and merchandise, the real pirates remain. Their bones lie scattered across coral reefs, their ships buried under centuries of silt. Sometimes divers find them, cannons covered in barnacles, gold coins fused by salt, fragments of bottles once filled with rum. These discoveries remind us that they were real, that behind the romance there were human beings, flawed, brave, greedy, and alive. The ocean does not keep memories kindly, but it keeps them just long enough for us to rediscover them. And perhaps that is the truest image of piracy. Not the flag or the treasure, but the persistence of curiosity. Every time we dream of adventure, every time we stare at the horizon and wonder what lies beyond it, we echo that same restless spirit. Pirates, for all their crimes, embodied the same desire that drives explorers, scientists, and dreamers: the need to break boundaries. It is a dangerous impulse, but it is also what makes us human. When you think of pirates, you might imagine lawless men chasing gold under a black flag, shouting into the wind with a bottle of rum in one hand and a sword in the other. But beneath that image lies something far more complex, something almost philosophical. Piracy, in its essence, is a question about power. Who owns what? Who decides the rules? And why should anyone obey them? These are not questions limited to the deck of a ship. They are questions that have haunted humanity since the first time someone built a fence and called the land inside mine. In the early modern world, power was meant to be absolute. Kings ruled by divine right, merchants by privilege, and empires by conquest. But the sea was different. The ocean belonged to no one, and that terrified those who depended on it. Laws that worked on land dissolved into mist once a ship left the harbor. And it was in that emptiness, that legal vacuum, that piracy was born. Pirates were the embodiment of the world's fear of lawlessness, but also its fascination with it. They were the people who dared to live in the blank spaces on the map. You see, piracy has always existed where control ends. In a way, pirates were philosophers of chaos, not the kind who wrote treatises, but the kind who tested ideas by living them. They created their own codes, their own hierarchies, their own miniature societies. And though their world was brutal, it was also strangely democratic. Captains were elected, not born. Decisions were made collectively, not decreed by kings. Shares of plunder were divided according to agreed rules, not social class. In some ways, a pirate ship in the 18th century was more egalitarian than the England of the same era. The irony is delicious. Those whom society called criminals may have understood fairness better than those who judged them. Of course, their democracy had a rather limited membership. It did not extend to the people they robbed or to the prisoners who ended up walking the plank. A practice, by the way, that is largely a myth invented by storytellers, though pirates did sometimes maroon their enemies on deserted islands. Still, within their own community, there was a sense of justice, however rough. The sea has a way of forcing equality. When the storm hits, it does not care who has a title. But what truly fascinates me about pirates is not just their structure, but their psychology. Imagine living every day knowing that death could come from any direction: a cannonball, a mutiny, a hangman's rope. To survive that kind of life, you must learn to detach from fear. You must, in some twisted sense, make peace with chaos. Many pirates did this through superstition, charms, tattoos, rituals, and omens. The black flag itself was not merely a threat to others. It was a talisman for those who flew it. It reminded them that they had already accepted death, and therefore had nothing left to lose. That kind of fearlessness can look like courage or like madness, depending on where you stand. It is also telling that so many pirates turned to the sea out of desperation rather than choice. For some, piracy was not rebellion, but survival. In the 17th and 18th centuries, sailors were among the most exploited workers in the world. Merchant captains were often tyrants, wages were low, punishments brutal, and conditions lethal. Disease, hunger, and storms took more lives than enemy fire. For many men, turning pirate was not an act of greed. It was an escape from servitude. A life outside the law was preferable to a lawful death in service of a master who saw them as expendable cargo. In that sense, piracy was a symptom of inequality. When the world is built on unfairness, rebellion is not a mystery. It is an inevitability. And yet, society has always had an uneasy relationship with rebellion. We condemn it in practice, but admire it in story. We like our outlaws romantic, as long as they stay fictional. Pirates, in particular, offered something that most people could only dream of: absolute freedom. They sailed wherever they wished, answered to no authority, and divided their spoils as equals. In an age of rigid class structures, that kind of autonomy was intoxicating, both for those who lived it and those who heard about it. The sea became a metaphor for freedom itself, vast, unpredictable, and indifferent to the rules of men. But freedom, of course, comes at a price. The very lack of structure that made piracy liberating also made it self-destructive. Without the constraints of law, there was nothing to restrain greed, envy, or paranoia. Mutiny was a constant threat. Loyalty lasted only as long as the next storm or the next chest of gold. Many pirate crews ended not in battle, but in betrayal. In that way, piracy is a perfect reflection of human nature, our endless struggle between cooperation and self-interest. Even in a world without kings, someone still wants to be captain. What is also striking is how the idea of piracy forced empires to confront their own hypocrisy. The line between pirate and privateer was paper-thin. A privateer was, essentially, a government-approved pirate. A man given a letter of marque allowing him to attack the ships of enemy nations. When wars ended, those same men often continued their trade without permission. Overnight, patriots became criminals. The only difference was paperwork. Empires, in their wisdom, called it commerce raiding when they benefited and piracy when they did not. It is difficult not to smile at that. History, as always, depends on who is holding the pen. And perhaps that is why pirates continue to fascinate us even now. They expose the contradictions of civilization, the fact that our systems of order are built on controlled violence, and our wealth often born of exploitation. Pirates simply removed the pretense. They robbed openly instead of politely. They were thieves, yes, but honest ones. In their brutal, unpolished way, they held up a mirror to the societies that condemned them, and that, perhaps, is what truly made them dangerous. Consider, for example, the moral panic that swept Europe in the early 18th century as piracy reached its peak. Newspapers described pirates as monsters, as if they were supernatural beings. Sermons compared them to demons, warnings that their souls were already damned. The gallows became public spectacles, with crowds cheering as the condemned swung. It was as though society needed to exercise its own fear by watching others punished for it. But underneath the noise, there was also envy. A whisper that perhaps, deep down, people admired their defiance. The same sailors who cursed pirates at sea would later sing songs about them in taverns. The boundary between villain and hero blurred like a horizon at dusk. Even today, the word pirate carries that duality. It means both criminal and adventurer, villain and freedom seeker. We have tamed the symbol, but not the idea. Modern culture dresses it up in humor and nostalgia. But the core remains the same. The dream of living unchained. And maybe that is why the pirate will never truly vanish. Empires rise and fall, laws change, and technology advances. But as long as there are people who feel trapped by authority, there will be pirates. On the sea, on the internet, or in the imagination. Piracy, in the end, is not just about ships and treasure. It is about the eternal human tension between order and chaos. We build societies to protect ourselves, but part of us always resents the walls we build. The pirate represents that inner contradiction, the longing for safety and the hunger for danger. That is why, no matter how many laws are written, how many flags are raised, or how many ships patrol the seas, piracy always returns. It is not a flaw in civilization. It is one of its shadows. And the bigger the empire, the darker the shadow it casts. You can still feel that shadow in our culture today. When we talk about pirate radio, pirate software, or pirate copies, we are not simply describing theft. We are invoking rebellion. There is always an element of defiance, of challenging the gatekeepers. It is the same old story told in new language. The black flag may have become digital, but it still flutters proudly in the wind of resistance. It is curious how humanity never quite knows what to do with its rebels. We need them and fear them in equal measure. They remind us that every system of control eventually creates its own opposition. Perhaps that is why the stories of pirates endure, because they speak to that eternal tug-of-war between obedience and freedom. We may live in apartments instead of on ships, and our oceans may now be made of pixels rather than water, but the current is the same. Somewhere, deep inside, there is a part of every person that longs to sail away and never return. When you think about it, pirates were never truly erased from history. They simply changed uniforms. Their ships became corporations, their flags became logos, and their cannons turned into contracts. The tools evolved, but the instincts stayed the same. The story of piracy, at its core, is the story of rebellion against monopoly, against whoever claims too much control over trade, knowledge, or movement. It is the same spirit that drives smugglers, hackers, and even whistleblowers today. In the 17th century, pirates challenged empires. In the 21st, digital pirates challenge corporations. Both claim the same justification: that power should not be hoarded. Of course, their methods are not always noble. Stealing is still stealing, whether it's gold doubloons or copyrighted songs. But what fascinates me is how the moral landscape shifts depending on who holds the power. When a small man steals from a rich empire, he is a pirate. When a rich empire steals from a small nation, it is called commerce. Perspective, as it turns out, is worth more than gold. There's also something inherently human about the idea of resisting authority. From ancient myths to modern cinema, we are drawn to those who defy the rules. Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, Robin Hood robbing the rich to feed the poor, or a group of ragtag pirates defying the king's navy. The pattern repeats because it touches a deep psychological chord. We crave structure, but we also crave freedom from it. It is a contradiction that defines us. Even as we build walls, part of us dreams of climbing over them. In many ways, the fascination with pirates is a safe way for us to indulge that fantasy. We can admire their courage without having to live their chaos. Watching a pirate film or reading a swashbuckling novel lets us experience danger without risking scurvy or cannon fire. It's the same reason people love roller coasters. Controlled fear, neatly packaged for entertainment. Deep down, the human mind seems to enjoy flirting with danger, as long as it can do so from a comfortable distance. But for all their romance, pirates were not rebels against morality. They were rebels against hypocrisy. They saw that the same merchants who condemned piracy often became rich from slave labor, stolen land, and exploitation. Empires called their plunder trade. But to the men at sea, it was all the same game, just with better uniforms. Some pirates even declared their disdain for hypocrisy outright. The English pirate Sam Bellamy once said to a captured captain, "You rob the poor under the cover of law, and we plunder the rich under the protection of our own courage." It was, in its way, a philosophical statement. Blunt, cynical, and hard to refute. It's also worth noting that pirate ships were among the few places in the early modern world where a man could rise through merit rather than birth. In most societies, your destiny was decided by your family name. But aboard a pirate ship, it was decided by your skill with a rope, your courage in a fight, or your ability to keep the rum dry during a storm. Captains were chosen by vote, and could be deposed by the same. It was not exactly democracy as we know it, but it was something close, democracy with cannons. Some historians even call pirate ships floating republics. They were crude, imperfect, and temporary, but they proved that even among thieves, there could be order. Perhaps that's why governments feared them so deeply, not just because they broke the law, but because they hinted at a world that could exist without kings. That kind of egalitarianism was rare in the 17th century. The idea that every man had a voice, even one born in poverty, was radical. It anticipated, in its chaotic way, the revolutions that would come later. The American, the French, the Haitian. Those revolutions were led by men in wigs and coats. But their ideas, equality, liberty, shared power, had already been tested in rough form on the decks of pirate ships. History has a strange sense of humor. Sometimes, the seeds of democracy are planted in the soil of lawlessness. Pirates also played a curious role in the history of race. Many crews were remarkably diverse, including Africans, freed slaves, and indigenous people who had escaped colonial oppression. On land, those men would have been divided by race and status. At sea, they were brothers in crime. That is not to say that pirate life was free from prejudice. Far from it. But the shared danger of the ocean made equality a practical necessity. You cannot afford to hate the man who holds the rope that keeps your ship afloat. Some historians believe that this multicultural mix helped spread ideas of equality long before political philosophers put them into words. A ship that included Africans, Europeans, and Caribbean islanders working side by side was, in its way, a small-scale experiment in cooperation. It did not always end well. Pirate crews could be as brutal as they were democratic. But it showed that people from wildly different backgrounds could live and fight together when their survival depended on it. Perhaps that, too, is part of why the pirate myth endures. It imagines a world where hierarchy is replaced, however briefly, by necessity and respect. And yet, even in their fleeting equality, pirates carried within them the same flaws that haunt every human society. Greed, ambition, betrayal. Many ships fell apart not because of naval battles, but because of arguments over treasure. It is an old story. Power, once tasted, is hard to share. The same men who voted for freedom often ended up fighting for dominance. It's almost comforting, in a darkly humorous way, to realize that even pirates couldn't make democracy work without a few fistfights. Perhaps that says more about us than we'd like to admit. It is also important to remember that piracy, for all its ideals and adventures, was sustained by violence. The cannon fire, the cutlass, the screaming, it was all very real. The romance we attach to it now is a luxury of distance. The sea erases the blood faster than memory does. But even within that violence, there were rules, what pirates called their articles. Each crew agreed upon them before setting sail, and they governed everything from how spoils were divided to how disputes were settled. Punishments for breaking those rules could be harsh, marooning, whipping, or worse. But the fact that these laws existed at all is remarkable. They prove that even in anarchy, humans instinctively create order. We are social creatures, even when we pretend not to be. And perhaps that is what makes the study of pirates so fascinating. They were neither pure villains nor noble heroes. They existed in the gray zone between civilization and savagery. The same gray zone we all inhabit, just with better hats. They remind us that morality is not a fixed compass, but a shifting current. What one era calls justice, another calls tyranny. What one calls freedom, another calls rebellion. The pirate's life, brutal as it was, forces us to confront that ambiguity. Even now, when we look at modern history, we can see echoes of piracy in unexpected places. Revolutionaries, rebels, activists all share the same DNA: defiance, courage, and a deep suspicion of authority. The difference is not in spirit, but in circumstance. Where the pirate had a ship and a sea, the modern rebel has a platform and a screen. Both live on the edge of the acceptable, challenging the powers that define what order means. And as long as power exists, there will always be those who test its limits. If pirates have taught humanity anything, it is that order without justice breeds rebellion. People will tolerate hardship, but not hypocrisy. They will obey law, but not tyranny. When authority becomes too absolute, someone will always raise a black flag. That is as true today as it was 300 years ago. The flags may look different, some stitched from cloth, others made of pixels. But the wind that lifts them is the same. When we talk about pirates, it is tempting to think of them as something separate from civilization, as if they were an anomaly, a strange accident in an otherwise orderly world. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. Pirates were not born outside civilization. They were born from it. They were sailors of empires, soldiers of trade, merchants of greed. Their ships were built by the very societies that later hunted them. They were, in every sense, civilization's children, disowned when they refused to obey. That, perhaps, is why the story of piracy endures. It is not simply a tale of crime, but a parable about human contradictions. Every empire creates its own pirates. Every system of order gives rise to those who reject it. And every generation, no matter how advanced, must decide whether it will tighten its rules or listen to the rebels who test them. The sea, after all, has always been a place where such questions rise and fall with the tide. Think of how deeply piracy is tied to the idea of freedom, not the sanitized, patriotic kind that comes with parades and speeches, but the raw, unfiltered kind that terrifies kings and comforts dreamers. For the pirate, freedom meant living without guarantees. No safety, no structure, no future. Only the present moment, the wind, and the will to survive. It is a version of freedom few of us could bear for long, but one that every human being secretly understands. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the routines and responsibilities, there is always a small voice that whispers, "What if I left it all behind?" That whisper is what makes pirates so timeless. They are the embodiment of the question that no civilization ever fully answers. How much freedom can a person have before they stop being human? Too much order, and life becomes a cage. Too little, and it becomes chaos. Pirates lived on that knife's edge, too free to belong, too wild to endure. Their lives were brief, but vivid, like sparks on dark water. And even centuries later, those sparks still glow in our imagination. It is worth remembering that for all their brutality, pirates were thinkers in their own way. Not in books or manifestos, but in action. They challenged the idea that authority was divine, that class was destiny, and that justice flowed only downward. They showed that even the most outlawed people could create their own systems of law and fairness, however imperfect. In doing so, they revealed something profound about human nature: that morality is not given, but chosen. Even in lawlessness, people invent rules. Even in chaos, they crave structure. It is an odd irony. We cannot escape the need to organize, even when we flee organization. And yet, piracy was not just rebellion. It was reflection. It forced the world to look at itself, to see the exploitation that made empires rich, to see the inequality that pushed men to desperation. Pirates were not philosophers by intention, but by consequence. They made the world confront its own contradictions, its greed, its arrogance. They asked, without words, if justice belongs only to the powerful, then who is truly criminal? The man who steals with a ship, or the one who steals with a crown? Even now, centuries later, those questions have not gone away. They have simply changed their scenery. The seas are quieter, but the spirit of piracy drifts through new domains. It sails through corporate corruption, through political defiance, through the digital underworld. The same tension plays out again and again, the dance between control and rebellion. We outlaw one kind of piracy and invent another. It is almost as if we need it, as if civilization breathes in order and exhales disobedience. But perhaps the most beautiful paradox of all is that pirates, the enemies of all nations, ended up uniting the world in ways no empire ever could. Their crimes forced countries to cooperate, to write laws that transcended borders, to recognize that the sea belonged to everyone and to no one. The modern idea of international law, the shared responsibility of humanity, owes more to pirates than to philosophers. That, I think, would have amused them greatly. For men who lived by no rules, they left behind quite a few. Of course, history has done its usual work of transformation. We have turned these desperate men and women into symbols of adventure, of rebellion, of independence. The truth was uglier and more tragic. But maybe that transformation serves a purpose. Every myth, after all, hides a moral. The pirate myth reminds us that freedom and justice are never permanent. They must be constantly renegotiated. It warns us that wealth built on exploitation will always breed resistance. And it comforts us with the thought that even in the darkest times, the spirit of defiance, the refusal to bow, still survives. There is also something poetic about how the ocean forgets. The waves erase the evidence, the coral grows over the wreckage, and the bones dissolve into sand. All that remains is the story. Perhaps that is fitting. The sea does not remember individuals. It remembers patterns. Storms come and go, but the tide remains. The same is true for humanity. Our rebellions rise and fall, our empires collapse. But the need for freedom, that old, restless current, always returns. When you think of it that way, piracy becomes not a historical oddity, but a mirror held up to the human soul. Every one of us, in some small way, is both sailor and pirate, part of the system, and yet tempted to defy it. We obey the rules until they no longer make sense. We follow the map until we suspect there might be treasure buried somewhere off its edge. That impulse, to question, to seek, to wander, is not evil. It is what keeps the species alive. And maybe that is why, when we read about pirates or watch them on screen, we feel something ancient stirring inside us. It is not admiration for their crimes, but recognition of their courage, the reckless, foolish courage to live by their own compass. We envy them not because they stole, but because they sailed, because they dared to go where others wouldn't, because for all their flaws, they were free. The ocean, when you look at it long enough, begins to resemble the human mind. Calm one moment, furious the next. Endless, unpredictable, and full of secrets that refuse to stay buried. Perhaps that is why so many pirates and poets found their truth there. The sea is honest. It gives nothing freely, but hides nothing forever. It is both creation and destruction, mercy and cruelty, all at once. When I think about those early pirates, I do not picture monsters or heroes. I picture human beings, fragile and proud, standing at the edge of the known world, staring into the horizon with wind-burned faces and salt in their hair. They must have felt something we rarely feel today, that mix of fear and awe that comes from realizing how small we are. Out there, under a sky so vast it could swallow you whole, there were no kings, no courts, no gods who answered quickly. Only the sound of the waves, the creak of the wood, and the endless whisper of the wind, as if the world itself were breathing around them. It is humbling, isn't it, to think that our ancestors once lived so close to nature's edge. To them, the sea was not a metaphor. It was a presence, alive, dangerous, divine. Sailors prayed to it, cursed it, and trusted it with their lives. And though the pirates mocked those prayers, they too were bound to its laws. The sea could give riches or take everything away in a single wave. It had no favorites, no loyalties, no politics. It was, in the truest sense, the great equalizer. That is perhaps the ultimate irony of piracy. Men who rejected kings still found themselves ruled by the sea. Freedom, it turned out, was never absolute. It always came with a cost, the cost of uncertainty, of danger, of never belonging anywhere for long. But perhaps that is why they chased it anyway. Because to live without freedom, even for safety, is a kind of slow drowning. And some souls would rather face the storm than the cage. There's an old sailor's saying, "A smooth sea never made a skilled sailor." And maybe that applies not just to sailors, but to civilizations. Maybe we need our pirates, not the literal kind, but the dreamers, the questioners, the ones who refuse to accept the world as it is. They remind us that progress begins with disobedience, that every law, every right, every freedom we now enjoy was once considered rebellion, and that every generation, like every ship, must find its own course and its own balance between order and freedom. In a sense, we are all still navigating. Our oceans have changed, but the journey hasn't. We sail through invisible waters now, currents of data, tides of information, storms of opinion. Our ships are made of light and language, and our treasures are measured in knowledge, not gold. But the risks are the same. Greed, corruption, arrogance, they still lurk beneath the surface, waiting for anyone who sails too carelessly. And sometimes, even now, you can feel the old winds rising again. Whenever someone questions authority, challenges injustice, or dares to dream beyond the horizon, you can almost hear the echo of a sail unfurling in the dark. Perhaps that's what the legend of the pirate really is. A metaphor for the restless part of the human spirit, the part that refuses to settle, that looks at the map and says, "What lies beyond?" We might not raise black flags anymore, but the same hunger lives on, to explore, to defy, to become. And maybe that hunger is not something to fear. Maybe it is what keeps us alive. When the last pirate ship sank beneath the waves, the age of empires cheered. But the sea, I imagine, did not. It simply rolled over their wrecks, indifferent as ever, keeping their bones and their stories safe beneath its endless blue. Even now, their names survive, whispered by history, sung in songs, printed on maps. Men and women who lived fast, died young, and in doing so, left behind something that neither the gallows nor the tide could erase. A reminder that freedom, however brief, is worth the risk. Sometimes I wonder if that is why the ocean still calls to us, why people travel to its edge just to stare into it. We say we go for the view, but I think we go for the feeling. That quiet recognition that everything is larger than we are. And yet somehow, we belong to it. The sea, like time, like history, is patient. It watches us build our empires, our ships, our myths, and then gently takes them back. It teaches us over and over again that nothing lasts forever, not glory, not power, not even the memory of who we were. And maybe that is not tragedy. Maybe it is grace. Because in the end, the pirate's story, like the story of humanity itself, is not about winning or losing. It is about movement, the endless cycle of creation and collapse, of rebellion and reconciliation, of departure and return. We rise, we fall, we rise again, each wave following the last, each generation rewriting the same song with new words. It is the rhythm of life, written in salt and wind. And so, as the night deepens, and the waves outside our imagination begin to quiet, I find myself thinking not of the ships, or the battles, or the treasures, but of the silence that followed them. The sound of a calm sea after a storm. That moment when the wind dies, the sails hang loose, and the only thing left is the steady pulse of the water against the hull. It is in that silence that history breathes. It is there, between one tide and the next, that we remember who we are. The world has changed since the age of pirates, but the sea hasn't. It still waits, vast and unbothered, carrying the ghosts of 1,000 dreams. Somewhere out there, beyond the last light of the shore, the moon is reflected on the water, the same moon they once sailed beneath. And if you listen closely, you might still hear it. The faint creak of a mast, the soft flap of canvas, the whisper of voices carried on the wind. Not haunting, not frightening, just present. The past never really disappears. It drifts patiently just below the surface. So rest now. Let the waves carry your thoughts away. The pirates are gone, but their story remains. A story of courage, of folly, of defiance, and of humanity. The ocean is calm again, the stars are out, and the tide continues its endless rhythm. And somewhere, in that rhythm, is the quiet reminder that every human heart is a ship, fragile, stubborn, and always searching for the horizon. Close your eyes. Listen to the sea within you. The wind is gentle now. The stars are steady. And the story, like the tide, will return again tomorrow. Good night.